we take a look at the trade portrait for 2012, we had a net deficit of about $1.6 billion US dollars, which was made up of about $5.6 billion worth of oil and gas deficit, but $4.0 billion worth of non-oil and gas surpluses. And if we fast forward to the first 4 months of 2013, the portrait looks as follows. We have about $4.5 billion worth of oil and gas deficit and about $2.7 billion worth of non-oil and gas surplus. It's daunting, the way the economy is moving and also the way we are consuming more and more of not only the same thing, but more of new and different things. Ceteris paribus, if we were to continue on this path, I think the trade account is going to look a little more adverse than we might have seen in 2012. As you would know, a few days ago, the government took action in reducing the fuel subsidy as to help not only with respect to the fiscal posture of this country, but there's hope that this will have positive repercussions on other things, including the trade account. Now, as badly as it may sound, in terms of where the trade account might have gone from 2011 to 2012 and 2012 to 2013, there's a good part of this. The good part is that there was a more than proportional increase in the importation of capital goods and raw materials in 2012, vis-a-vis the numbers in 2011. There was also a decline in the importation of finished goods in 2012, vis-a-vis 2011. That means the thesis or narrative of Indonesia's moving up the value chain as to create more value-added stuff onto the table is working. As such, we need to be importing more raw materials and capital goods and fewer or less of the finished goods in 2012. The first 4 months of this year, the importation of raw materials continues to rise, vis-a-vis that in the same period of 2012, whereas the importation of capital goods has declined. But the importation of finished goods continues to decline. This, I think, is something that not only we have to look at, but I think bankers have to look at. Because we need to make sure that there is a continuing momentum of importing raw materials and capital goods for the purpose of moving up the value chain, building the factories, building all the capacities that will be needed for Indonesia to move up the value chain. Because at the end, we will be able to export goods and services that will be multiples of the values reflected in our merely exporting raw materials or commodities. That, I think, is the aspiration for Indonesia. That is the aspiration for anybody in Indonesia who wants to make sure that Indonesia is on the right path to becoming, whether it's the member of the G8, as the CEO Bank Mandiri aptly pointed out a few minutes ago, or the aspiration of any Indonesian banker, any Indonesian industrialist, to make sure that Indonesia becomes not only an economic relevance, but a geopolitical relevance in the global community. Now, I'll take you to the world stage. The world stage is characterized by certain characteristics that may be dim, but in some parts less did. And you take a look at Europe, I think it's clear that the economies of Europe have been and will be stagnating, if not contracting, in the next few years. We take a look at the U.S., we're seeing sustained recovery. This is, I think, propelled not only by the policies that were promulgated by the administration, but this is propelled by a couple of obvious things. First is the demographics of the United States, and the second is energy transformation. The energy transformation in the U.S. basically involves new discoveries of shale gas, which I think have become phenomenal by way of being able to avail gas at a cost of $2 to $3 per MMBTU. That would significantly change or game change the landscape of manufacturing and everything that's needed within the economic equation. This will, I think, affect the globe, the planet, from an economic standpoint. We've got to game change ourselves in terms of making sure that energy is availed in a more cost-efficient and cost-effective way. We've got to make sure that we become more competitive. Not only for the purpose of the paradigm of self-sufficiency, but for the purpose of the paradigm of becoming the most efficient exporter in the world. This is a bit of pushing the envelope and pushing the barriers of reason for many Indonesians. But there is no reason for us not to be able to think like that, because Indonesia is youthful. Indonesia is blessed with a demographic profile that will stay on the same way in the next 10 to 20 years. And I think we've got to aspire for the moon, or for Mars, or Pluto, because if not, we're going to be left behind. Now, Indonesia is blessed as to become host to the APEC Summit in the early part of October, where trade is going to be a big component of the discussions amongst the 21 leaders of the APEC community. One of which is the introduction of some agricultural products, including palm oil, as to classify it as an environmentally friendly product. So it will be treated with some de minimis tariff treatment. That is a resounding political success for not only Indonesia, but for all 21 members of the APEC community. We're on track in terms of creating the path to success. Indonesia does not make solar panels. Indonesia does not make fancy, dandy, sophisticated technological products like the United States would be able to, Koreans would be able to, Japan would be able to. But at least Indonesia can show and be recognized by the world that we are committed to becoming more environmentally friendly, and we have some products that could be recognized as environmentally friendly. Now, this will, I think, dovetail into the next event in December, which will be called the MC9 Ministerial Conference, the 9th Ministerial Conference for the WTO, where 159 ministers of trade around the world will convene in Bali, which is a real incentive, to basically talk about trade, the latest and the greatest of trade, and where we need to go from here. The latest and the greatest are basically three, ladies and gentlemen. The first is whether or not the global community would be able to give recognition to the least developed countries, the poor countries in Africa, and some of our brothers and sisters from Cambodia, Laos, and what have you, within the ASEAN community, whether or not we can give special treatment so that their goods and services that come here will be given a special treatment. That special treatment being defined as duty-free, quota-free. No duty, no quota. That, I think, is a noble aspiration, which not only the big emerging countries like Indonesia, India, Brazil, and China, but also the more developed countries like the United States would, I think, be able to give recognition to. The second latest and greatest item is with respect to the agriculture package. This relates to whether or not the developed countries and the developing countries, and also the least developed countries, could come to an agreement as to whether or not there is a way to recognize the aspirations of the developing countries, particularly India, which aspires to basically have some capacity to stockpile agricultural products to a certain level, which is a little bit beyond what was agreed at the Uruguay round in the mid-80s. This is a game changer, ladies and gentlemen. I know many of you have never heard about this, but this is what people talk about when we meet up amongst trade ministers. But at the end of the day, this will affect banking. This will affect the way the customers of banks will have to behave going forward. The polarity between how the Americans are thinking and the Indians are thinking with regards to the agriculture package is an issue to be addressed in the next few months. And Indonesia, I think, served as an honest broker to basically mediate between the interest of the developed countries and the interest of the large developing countries, and also the interest of the least developed countries. The third latest and greatest that will be discussed at the upcoming WTO meeting in December is the issue of trade facilitation. Trade facilitation is essentially about making sure that goods and services are facilitated or moved in a more efficient and effective way at the ports, at the customs, and wherever the goods and services have to move through. Udi had aptly pointed out that the richest and oldest three professions are traders, bankers, and customs. I can't disagree. But as old as they are, they can sometimes become the most contentious when we meet. Now, if we talk to our African friends, do they want to move the boxes at the ports or at the airports faster? If they were to move the boxes or the containers 30 days, if we ask them, can you move it in 5 days? I think the response invariably could be a no, but it could also be invariably a yes. A yes on the condition that, okay, I'll move the box faster, more efficiently, more effectively. I'll do it in 5 days. I can even do it in 4 days. I'll facilitate trade. You pay me. This is the typical attitude of the poor countries and the developing countries. And I think it is appropriate, because at the end of the day, they've got to be compensated. This is where I think the more developed countries have to start thinking, okay, I have to give you financial aid, financial assistance, ensure that trade gets facilitated better. To the extent it gets facilitated better, there's a study being done by so many institutions around the world, including the World Bank, that if we were to be able to reduce the cost of trade facilitation by, say, 1%, it translates to about a delta, a positive delta of about $40 to $50 billion worth of trade. And there's also a study that shows that a good chunk of this delta is going to be benefited more by the developing and less developed countries as opposed to the developing economies. This is noble. This is something that we've got to make sure that this gets advanced in the discussions in the upcoming WTO meeting. Now, I think you all know that Indonesia has played a role in this, not only as a host to the upcoming MC9 in Bali in December, but Indonesia is a member of the ASEAN community. And as you all know, we are approaching 2015. 2015 is significant in a number of ways. One of which is that that will be the culmination of the national single window for all members of ASEAN. But it also is significant because it culminates ASEAN Economic Community. This is something that not many people in Phnom Penh understand. This is not something that people in Samosir understand. This is not something that our brothers and sisters in Manawari would understand. What is ASEAN Economic Community? ASEAN Economic Community basically translates into the spirit of brotherhood or sisterhood when it comes to doing economic activities with each other. We want to make sure that goods and services get transferred from one place to another in the most efficient and effective way. The real issue is, are we ready? Are we ready in terms of readying and availing all the infrastructure? And are we ready, most importantly, to compete? Would our friends in Phnom Penh be able to compete with products that will be coming in from Chiang Mai, from Hanoi, from Brunei, from Johor, from Singapore, from Yangon, from wherever amongst these 10 nations in Southeast Asia? Which is why the paradigm of self-sufficiency has to be moved society. The paradigm of becoming the most efficient exporter has to be put in place for everybody in this room, for everybody in Indonesia. Because until and unless that gets done, we're not going to be able to compete. We're not going to be able to compete because we have, ladies and gentlemen, moved into the corridor of liberalization. We have moved into the era of globalization. Globalization and liberalization basically involve the opening of doors and windows and whatever so that goods and services could come in. Which is why trade facilitation has to be put in place, but with the full understanding that economies have to move forward, not backward. See, here's the glitch. When we meet up with our ASEAN partners, we talk about liberalizing trade, investment, and all that. But there's a social component to this. There's a political component to this. There's an X component to this. ASEAN is a little bit different from the European Union. The European Union is a union of customs, a union of monetary policies, a union of fiscal policies, whereas ASEAN sits on the three pillars of socio-political, cultural, and economic. There's a lot of spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood, and a lot of understanding with each other in terms of their limitations and their capabilities. Some countries would have to get legislative approval to basically liberalize a certain investment regulation. That, I think, serves as a built-in mechanism to basically control the pace at which we move forward. That is good, but that's also not so good. Good in the sense that we can move at the pace that we're ready from a political and social standpoint, but not good maybe because we're not moving as fast as other countries beyond ASEAN. Let's not forget, the United States are talking with the European Union about doing free trade. The United States is pioneering so-called TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, involving 4 ASEAN countries of Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, but also involving other large Latin American countries and Asian countries, which will, I think, be the definition of free trade going forward. Now, if they were to succeed on those initiatives, we might be left behind. But we make sure they understand we can only move at the pace that our political system, social system would allow us to. So, ladies and gentlemen, the competition is not going to get any easier. It's only going to get harder. It's only going to get harder, but we can only make it easier if the bankers get it right, if the industrialists get it right, if the policymakers get it right, at the central or the regional levels. If everybody gets it right. Now, we can only get it right if politically, socially, we get it right. We can get it right if economically we get it right. Now, it's not an impossibility. I see the glass as half full, not as half empty. And here's the sexy part. This is a $1 trillion economy that's growing at about 6% real growth, at least. Built-in inflation of 5 to 7% per year. Hypothetically, you're sitting in a country with the potential of creating, on a cumulative basis, an economic pie as big as $60 trillion in the next 20 years. $60 trillion cumulatively in the next 20 years. If we were to go by the assumption that 60% of that economic pie is going to be related to domestic consumption, $36 trillion are going to be related to domestic consumption. These are goods and services that will be consumed by the 250 million Indonesians in the next 20 years on a cumulative basis. Can you imagine how much banking is needed? Can you imagine how much freight forwarding is needed? Can you imagine how many services will be needed to make sure that the $36 trillion of economic pie creation in the next 20 years will be there for all of us to enjoy? But this is going to require big-time game-changing, making sure the infrastructure is ready, education is ready, and regulations get more simplified. And at the end of the day, we have to become more competitive. If not, the risk of a good chunk of that $36 trillion worth of consumption will be filled with products that are made outside Indonesia is not small. That's the risk. The risk that we will not be able to fill up that $36 trillion economic pie worth of domestic consumption will be high. Which is why interest rates have to come down. Which is why fiscal incentives have to be more targeted. Which is why economic development, inclusive of trade policies, investment policies, fiscal policies, and monetary policies, have to be right as to help Indonesia move in the right way, ASEAN in the right way, so the next time we meet in APEC or WTO, we can sing the song, Hallelujah. That's the reality. That's the possibility. And I think all of you can make it happen. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Pak.